Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Yeah, just kind of the normal office hours now. I've got OLI up. I've got Canvas up that kind of has the notes for the week. In another tab off screen that you can't really see, I have these resources pulled up. Um, so my current plan is just to kind of answer any questions people might have. And if no one really kind of comes in or has any questions, I'll probably just start going over some basic list stuff, just to kind of reiterate what's in OLI. But yeah, the lab definitely covers a ton of list stuff that I think is super important. This stuff in particular really transfers to the JavaScript you'll be using in PUI. Um, I mean, all the stuff hopefully will that we're kind of going over in this course, but I think lists are in Python transfer pretty well to kind of lists in JavaScript, and you'll definitely use them in all sort of ways. So definitely good to know about lists, which is why kind of the lab begins with all those questions. And don't forget, everything is zero indexed in programming. I know, especially if you don't have a background or familiarity with it, it definitely takes some getting used to sometimes. So, this list I made, for instance, has what, five elements in it. So, normally the way we count, it'd be like one, two, three, four. That's the fifth element. But when we're indexing into the array, which if you've gone through the OLI materials, you've encountered this. But if not, you when you do the fifth element in here, it's gives you an error, index out of range, because that's truly the fourth. And so on the same front, if you want the first element, you would do zero. And I'm actually not sure if this is covered. It's not. Um, I kind of hope it's actually not covered because I don't think you really need to know it. I personally have never used it, and I think it's just one of those like Python specific things too. But you can also use like negatives to access lists. So it's like this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So then if I'm at 0 and I'm -1, it just wraps back around here. So then for -2, go there. But yeah, I don't recall if it's in there. But if you struggled with that part, I would say just don't worry about the whole negative list thing. Oh, one thing too that I'll probably go over if there's no questions, just to make the office hours a little worthwhile, especially for the first 30 minutes. If 30 minutes goes by and there's no questions, then I'll probably call it early. Um, but like copying a list is something that sometimes gives people trouble, and you'll probably need for the homework, and definitely we'll be using it for latter homeworks, labs, and stuff. So there's like kind of multiple ways to copy lists. and a lot of it kind of gets into the whole assignment and just kind of like programming basics, and it can sometimes be, despite saying programming basics, it can sometimes be challenging to wrap your head around it. So if you like, x equals 5, y equals x, and now like x equals 10, right? So it's like, all right, what's the value of y now? Is it going to be 5 or is it 10 now? And it's 5. So a lot of problems, I wonder if I can find a good example too. So you can kind of get into trouble with this too if you have like a list one and you like modify a little, then you assign list two to it, and then you modify it again. Sometimes people, myself including, even to this day, I'll sometimes freak out. I'm like, wait, is it like the one before we changed or after? Um, so definitely watch out for that. That can get you into some debugging issues. But yeah, so we have this list I made earlier up, should still be on the screen, and we can't just do like, second list equals my list because it's not gonna do a copy that way. I'll show you how to do a copy. I believe one of the resources I linked, or two of them maybe, also showed a copy list. But when I do second list equals this original my list, then second list is just what's known as like a reference to the list. Um, so right, so you can see they're the same. But now if I do my list, let's I don't know what we're gonna do. So one way to remove an item, right, is remove. Let's take away the third item. Okay, so that makes sense. My list removed it. And now second list also has that same change. So what you can run into trouble with there is if I have, if I want two copies of a list and then I want to change the latter one, if I just do it like this, thinking I'm making a second copy, really I'm not, it's just a reference. So then any changes to that list will be reflected here. So definitely something to watch out for there. So that being said, let me add back an item to insert. I'm trying to remember. Is it just insert to third? Yeah, I think that was right. Okay. Yeah, so you can kind of add to lists in Python multiple ways. One being the insert command, which takes in two parameters. The first being the index on which to add the item into, and the second being the item. So I wanted to add back third into its right spot. So, 0 index, 1 index, and then the second one is where I wanted it. So that's why I put the 2 there, added it in. You can also do things like what list append, which as the name might imply, append was added to the very end of the list. And then to remove that, you could just do pop, I think. Yep, which will remove it and also return it. And again, those should be in either of these. Just kind of wanted to point to the documentation. And this, I mean, W3 Schools is really great for JavaScript and HTML, and their Python stuff's not bad, just for kind of knowing basic list examples. Yeah, so here's like basically kind of a nice little abridged summary of the things to do on lists. Maybe helpful for the lab as well. Um, okay, so question for number 2 in the lab. Can you provide any hint on how to concatenate the rest of the remaining string 1 to the new string if it's longer than string 2? Right, let me pull it up. Write the function alternate strings, takes two strings, it should alternate between the characters, right, in string 1. If anything's going to be longer, then it could be string 1, otherwise they're going to be equal size. Concatenate the rest. Right, so there's several ways you can do this, which is kind of why I liked it for a homework problem. And I will say there's like no right way of the different ways you can do it. But you could, so I would probably would just solve for the case first if you have it where if they're equal, then you're good. Um, so you might want to use a like for loop in particular for this one. And this first one's about lists mostly, for loop, while loop, um, kind of is the idea. But you could honestly you could use like a while for both of these, or you could use for both of these. But I would say probably the easiest way. Um, but if you are using like a for loop, right, and so say you have the case where they're both equal, then when you're looping over string one and string two, then it doesn't matter which one you use in the for loop for the latter part, right? So like, for x and range, however long string one is going to be the same as if you did that with string two, because they can both be, say, six uh, characters long. But you would probably want to use string one in that case because you know it's going to be longer. So then you can have a for loop that goes for the range of this and does something when you hit a certain length for the latter string. Or you could do two for loops. So if you know string two is always going to be the same length or shorter than string one, then you can assume that so if I have, let's go here. So if I have like, string two and it's equal to second, and I can do stuff like that to it, right? Index into the string. Then I'll know what's the longest one I can get here. 5 will give me the D. So I know indexes 0 through 6 are valid for string 2. And since I know string 2 is always greater than or equal to, less than or equal to string 1, then I know I can always do like that for string 1 and it'll be valid. But, string 1 could be like longer word. But on the flip side, I can't just assume that because this works for string 1, that it'll work for string 2. Because we know that string 2 is always going to be equal to or shorter than. So that being said, you could use like a for loop to maybe go through all the characters that you know are in string 2 and string 1, and then you'll know you'll end at the value, which is the length of string 2, and then you could loop over the rest of the characters in the first string, starting from the length of string 2, if that makes sense. I'm trying to be like hinty with it as opposed to just kind of like saying it. We will go over it Thursday as well. So I would definitely say uh, try your best on that. But hopefully that helps. Oh, don't be afraid to use more than one for loop um, and some variables. So let's actually just make second list empty. Nice. Okay, so I have my list, right? List of 5 items. And say I do want to make a true copy of it, so I can make modifications to this my list variable without affecting the copy. Then I could do second list equals my list dot copy. So right, I get the same thing. But now when I do like my list remove third, so removed it there, and then second list still has it. So the first time I did that, and it caught and it directly mimicked the change, it's because I just referenced it by doing that, which is not making a copy, but by actually calling dot copy on it, wherever that is, right here, it was making a true copy of it. And another way you can do that I don't think is mentioned is by doing, so let me set this to blank, right? You can do make a variable and then just pass it into this like list constructor. And so now it'll be the same. And if I modify second list, it should not affect my list because it's copy, and the same goes for the other way. So now my list only has 3 elements, and second list should still have 5. So it's kind of 2 different ways to copy a list, either by calling .copy on it or passing it into here, this list constructor. So something else that's, let's do for whoop, of course. So, for this for loop, range of 6, so we know it is 0 through 5 because we're 0 indexed, but it's still 6 elements, 6 ints, just starting with 0. So and then let's say we have, string 1, string 2. So then maybe we want to do like range of, I always forget these colons, y'all. So it's kind of the same thing, right? But we know now that the length of string 2 I can safely index into it using any of these to get the different characters I need. And then also you can do, so we did pass in 6, but we could do, say, let's start at 6 and go all the way to 10. So it's kind of telling it where to start and then where to stop. So maybe if something was like longer and we wanted those, it could be helpful. Yeah, I hope the for and while stuff was not too bad. A lot of examples in here, which is nice. Hope everyone's kind of running the code. I think I use for loops like way more than while loops, but while loops have a purpose, so. But I feel, especially for a lot of like web programming stuff I do that involves different JavaScript stuff, that I do find myself in like for loops to iterate over something because I think it's just a cleaner way to do it. Like if I do want to iterate over items in a list, or if I want to show something, 10 times in a certain way because I'm displaying it on a laptop versus a phone or something. So I guess that's why there's kind of more emphasis on the for as well in here. Nested fors can get a little tricky when you have like multiple nestings within a for, or if you have like an initial for up here, then several lines of code, and then like another for loop in there. I can see that causing some confusion, which again is why print statements are like so friendly. Because right below a for, if you just put a print, especially when I'm debugging too, I'll actually do something like open up a new file. So if I have like, I'll just actually copy this. Hope my indentation's fine. So if I'm in here, and then usually it's like lots of code, and then like later on, while I'm still in the same for, I might want to do something else. Um, then I'll often forget, or when I'm doing this something else, I'll be like, oh, I expect X to print 5 times. Why am I getting like 50 X's? So then I usually be like, print first for loop, and then just do the exact same thing. Second for loop, and then you can kind of run and see how it's like calling the loop. So then I'm like, oh, okay, so I'm getting what, 1, 2, 3, 4 of these called for every one of these. So that might kind of explain some behavior that I'm expecting or not expecting. So definitely feel free to throw in those print statements all you'd like, especially as we get into the course and the homeworks. I think the more and more we're going to have the homeworks kind of turn into these larger kind of like projects in a way, as opposed to like, oh, just complete these like certain amount of functions. It'll be more of like, build X that involves the concepts that we learned about. Um, and then, you're kind of working on this file and like making your own functions, and your submission could have like 2 functions and like a decent amount of lines, but someone's could add like 10 functions, but technically like it's still right. It just depends on how you approach it. So as we get to that where it's kind of less structured, but there's like a similar end goal, then I think the whole like kind of debugging aspect will really come more into play. And hopefully I can help with that too. But sometimes if you'll come to me like a 200 line file that I haven't seen before, I'll definitely be like, hey, so like, what have you tried? What exactly do you think maybe the problem is? How are you diagnosing it? Um, so print statements definitely will help you. I mean, the amount of times I've written like, like I'm here, or like print, like look here. I'd say like thousands of times. I mean, even this morning alone, I think I probably made about like 50 look here print statements in this one thing I was doing. So I would say no such thing as too much print. And then as you kind of work through, so it's like, oh, well, we know this is definitely correct. So, let's remove this print statement. And then if I'm debugging, I don't know if I would want 2 in a row, but I'd be like, yeah, that's fine. especially if you're like modifying variables. And it's like, say I had another 4 down here for like I and range, like x to 10, and then I do some like wonky stuff with x up here. Or it's like, honestly, I don't know what that is. So then maybe I do want to like print it out to figure it. It's like, oh, 27, okay. So definitely printing the variables, in addition to just kind of having print statements in there to let you know where you are. Super, super helpful for debugging. And even like searching for the error you got. So if I did something like this, well, that's invalid syntax. What's like a, I guess it's pretty kind of straightforward. It even gives you the exact area divided by 0. Um, but definitely kind of like Googling the error message you get. I'd say this is particularly going to be more so Python at least kind of user friendly in that regard, especially for this course. I think most errors you'll get will kind of point you to the exact line and be at least readable. Um, but for a lot of more web stuff, you'll get, and especially if you're using libraries like modules for JavaScript that you did not write, you'll get some like kind of wild errors. Or if you're not even familiar with the web space, like I've been in that space for quite some time, and I still have to Google some of these errors that people would consider like very basic because it's like, oh, it's on a 403, and I'm like, look, off the top of my head, I don't know what a 403 is, so I'll just Google, copy and paste the exact kind of message I get here, just put it in my tab and search. It's another kind of helpful debugging tool. If you are also searching for kind of material, especially around for and while loops, outside of the kind of resources I linked, you may see something that talks about like big O, or you may see something like a notation like that, or like, n squared. Um, and that has to do a lot with like the run times and like efficiency of like algorithms. Like a for loop that loops over 10 items is faster than a for loop that loops over 10 items and has another nested for loop in it. Things like that, like when you're doing a nested for loop, it's obviously going to be slower than just a single kind of for loop with the same value because you have to loop over like more items. Um, but that is kind of beyond this class. And yeah, I just pushed in a lot of intro to CS courses, and it's one of those things that's like, yeah, maybe it's useful if you're working on like really kind of low end things, but if you're doing like web apps or just some general kind of like software coding or just like want to use it as a toolkit, it's not the most important, I would say, especially with the way technology's moving. If I do an inefficient for loop when I could have done something else, I won't really see the effects. So don't want anyone to get confused with that. Also, later on in the course we'll kind of talk about like dictionaries in particular. Um, Maybe tuples as well, I think. So this is just like a kind of a list is a data structure. As you know, we're just kind of storing um, these different variables and values. And what's cool about Python, I guess you could say cool, is you can have um, all types of stuff in the list, and it's a value list. But in some other programming languages, it's not the case. You basically, if you have like a list like this, quote unquote, then they'd have to be all of the same type. So you'd have to have, all strings or like all numbers um, of the same type, even like an int versus a float. You'd have to have like all of these, and then you'd have to have like, different kind of floats. Um, but JavaScript is similar to Python in this regard in that it's like not a type language, so you can kind of have these structures of whatever, which kind of makes it nice. Um, but on the flip side, if you're like iterating through the list, it makes it kind of difficult because you can't just assume per se everything is going to be a string in a list. I mean, you can if you made like the function, right? But if you had a website or a program and you were exposing it to a user and they had to input a list, and whatever they input you would kind of run through a function, and you'd be like, put your birthday in, and then maybe you hope they submit like September or just like the word or something, right? But then they could enter like '09 and or just 9, and that could mess your function up because you may be expecting a string like the word September, but really they put in like the number 9. But there's things you can do to force that in Python. But just kind of a side meta note that lists can be different types, which I believe the lab asks about. So there's a freebie. But yeah, I think that's kind of what I just wanted to cover. Touched on for loops a little bit. A pretty big emphasis on lists. Homework one will be out, or homework two will be out pretty soon. Grades for homework one, lab one, and quiz one. Also soon this week. Um, we'll go over the lab Thursday, and I'll probably just go ahead and cut these office hours short so I can continue kind of grading stuff for this course in the allotted time. Unless anyone has a question, then we can go over something else. But otherwise, I will probably sign off. And I'll be on Piazza as well. So if something comes up, I think I actually have to answer a question on Piazza. I haven't checked it today. All right, going to sign off. Yep, good luck with everything, and I'll maybe see you Thursday for the kind of recitation lab. If not, that'll get posted, and it'll probably be the full hour as we work through it. And I will try to remember to make comments in the chat on like we're starting the first part, we're starting the second part. That way, if you just kind of wanted to, like if you only cared about question 2 out of the 3 questions, you could maybe jump around the video a little smoother, because I imagine that can get pretty annoying when the videos are longer. Yeah, and I'll also update. I think I did for the last one too. Like last one was an hour, and I said, hey, the last 30 minutes, it's just kind of me being silent, doing something on my laptop. So disregard. So I will kind of do the same thing for all these videos. I'll say, hey, we went over mostly stuff about lists, touched on that resource, and dabbled a tiny, tiny bit with number 2 in the lab. So I'll try to keep the video descriptions up to date too once they process, which usually is about an hour after this. So yeah, if you wanted to rewatch anything, I think you can maybe go ahead and do it while it's live, but the video should also be up in an hour. And yeah, I think you'll get emails when the grades go out and stuff. But I'll probably try to get all 3 quiz, homework, and lab grades out at the same time so then I can just post a single announcement. It'll probably be later in the week, but the ones I've gone through so far have been good, so don't fret. And yeah, see you Thursday.